Good evening, and thank you for joining us today for this very special NWHM Presents program in conversation with author JoAnn Hill. And happy Women's History Month. Throughout the month of March, the National Women's History Museum is paying tribute to the women on whose shoulders we stand, celebrating inspiring women's stories and encouraging all women to share and remember their own value. Author, diplomat, and trained mediator Sharon Langley states that if we want our girls to benefit from the courage and wisdom of the women before them, we have to share the stories. In that spirit, today's program takes a closer look at unexpected places of memory making and women's history around our nation's capital. My name is Lorianne Turgeson, and I serve as the Vice President of Education at the National Women's History Museum. For those of you who are with us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have attended an NWHM program before, welcome back. And we thank you for your continued support. This special Women's History Month NWHM Presents programming is co-presented with DC Public Library and with generous underwriting support from Time Warner Media. Before we begin, please allow me to go over a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the museum's dedicated YouTube channel in the days following the event. Today's guests are available to answer your questions, so please use the chat feature for any comments that you have during the program, and use the Q&A feature on the tool ribbon at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you may have regarding the program. You may submit your questions at any time during the presentation. Thank you to those of you who submitted your questions in advance as well. I'm joined today by two very special guests, JoAnn Hill, author of Secret Washington, D.C., a guide to the weird, wonderful, and obscure, published in 2021, and a tour of her own CEO, Kaitlin Calogera, who will guide this afternoon's conversation. Kaitlin is a licensed tour guide, author, and entrepreneur who holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in history. After recognizing a lack of women's representation in public spaces, she founded the first tourism company in Washington, D.C. to focus exclusively on women's history. A tour of her own was established in 2018 to offer historical tours and special events that reframe the narrative by elevating women's stories. Calogera became a professional tour guide because she believes in education beyond the classroom and that tourism has the power to ignite social change. Her book, 111 Places in Women's History That You Must Not Miss, is a travel guidebook that encourages readers to explore sites and stories about women many who are overlooked in traditional textbooks. I encourage you to find that book and read it. It really is a great resource guide. With an extensive background in coaching female student athletes, Kaitlin's philosophies center around teamwork, empowerment, and education. An avid traveler and researcher, she believes in the idea that we all belong, but sometimes have to search deeper for the people, places, and stories we connect with most. We're grateful to have Kaitlin with us today to moderate our conversation, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest author this evening, JoAnn Hill. JoAnn is the author of Secret Washington, D.C., a guide to the weird, wonderful, and obscure, and has affectionately called Washington, D.C. home for over 20 years. She's written extensively about DC living, its food, and her world travels on her blog, dcglobejotters.org, and other mediums and publications. Through her writing and research, she shares hidden histories, off the beaten path locales, lesser known stories, and tips that inspire the insatiably curious explorer. When she's not writing, you'll find her teaching yoga and bar, indulging in DC's culinary and theater scenes with her husband, and spending as much time outside as possible being active. Her next book, DC Scavenger, will be released later this year, so be on the lookout for that. JoAnn lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and pup, and is the co-founder of Capital Teachers, a tutoring company servicing the greater D.C. area. This is such a fun way to encourage one another to keep seeking women's history and their stories as we round out Women's History Month. So please join me in welcoming JoAnn and Kaitlin to the screen.
Hello, thank you for the introduction.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Lorianne. Thanks for having us today. I'm super excited to be here.
I'm super excited to be moderating this conversation with you, JoAnn. I also just want to take this opportunity to thank Lorianne and the National Women's History Museum. Also, happy Women's History Month to everybody. We're coming to the end of it, but I think this is more a time to celebrate than ever. It is my honor to be here with you today, JoAnn, and I think that this is going to be a great program. I know I have lots of questions to ask you about your awesome book, Secret Washington, D.C., and we have lots of time to go through that. Before we get started, I want to give people some background and context about our professional relationship and how we landed in this room together tonight, because I want everyone to feel the warmth. I want everyone to feel the love. I want them to know that we are here like full of passion and friendship. You wrote this book during a really difficult and challenging time during the pandemic, and we'll get into that. And then you reached out to me and a tour of her own, trying to promote your book and say, hey, can we set up an event? And as soon as we met, I just felt like we were instant friends. I've loved learning about your stories and just picking your brain. And I know that you love Washington, D.C. just as I do. So I am so excited to bring all the people who are watching today into our conversation, into our world, and show them all the behind the scenes, the weird, wonderful, and obscure. So today we will focus mostly on women's history stories and just kind of, get to the places that you might not know about. Yeah. So let's start with the background. Tell us just like how this book came to be and why you decided to write it.
Yeah, well, and just to kind of piggyback on what you mentioned earlier, Kaitlin, is that I feel like tonight is kind of coming full circle and everything is kind of coming to like fruition to tonight, right? So I reached out to you a little bit over a year ago, and who would have ever thought kind of a year later we would be here together? I mean, that was always my hope, but but it's so nice of kind of how everything kind of moved forward and worked out. So anyways, very happy to be with you today. So to kind of backtrack, I have been writing a blog. I know Lorianne mentioned it earlier in my bio. I've been writing a travel DC focused food blog for years, and it's been a fairly small followed blog, mostly friends and family and so forth. But I am a former teacher, and always been a prolific writer. And I'm a big traveler. And so about a little over a decade ago, my husband and I were traveling in Egypt, and I met a woman. Her name is Christine Ruiz, and she lives in Galveston, Texas. And we kept in touch for years through social media. So fast forward about 10 years or so, she reaches out to me and she says, I'm writing a travel book, a guidebook for Galveston, Texas, and I think that you should write a book for Washington, D.C. And if you want, I can put you in touch with my publisher. I think this would be a really good fit. So of course, you say yes when something like that happens. This was fall of 2019. And I connected with her publisher, which is now my publisher, Reedy Press, and kind of got the ball rolling. And so I started writing this book in fall of 2019. And I was able to meet with tour guides and historians and curators and go to museums and kind of really explore and really kind of get out there and meet people and interview and so forth. And then of course, March 2020 came about and everything changed. And so I was about a little over 1/3 of the way into my book, less than half. And everything all of a sudden in DC and around the world was closed. And so I couldn't really reach out and talk to people. I couldn't go visit places, as we all know. And so I had to become very resourceful. And so I found myself venturing and going outside and exploring outdoor monuments and parks and gardens and lots of cemeteries and those kind of things that I could get to, which also honestly then I realized, well, if I can get to, then my readers can get there as well. And so this book actually during the pandemic ended up being very therapeutic for me because it gave me purpose. It gave me something to really focus on. And it gave me kind of an excuse to get out. And even during quarantine, I could walk and go outside and really explore the city through new eyes. I've lived here for about 20 years now. And so it's kind of nice to see a city that you've lived in for so long through a fresh perspective. And and this book turned out a little differently than I had initially planned. And honestly, I couldn't have been happier about that. So it really was, it became kind of a little bit of a savior for me during a really tough time.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's such beautiful perspective. I'm taking some notes as you speak, and one word that you used is resourceful. And I, as a historian, always use this word when we talk about women throughout history. We find a way. There's no obstacle too large to stop us. Not a pandemic, not the Smithsonian being closed down. And I think that that's so admirable about your story. It takes a certain kind of person like myself and you who just loves going to cemeteries and exploring. Right. I also that was like my escape also during the pandemic, and found really neat stories there. And then I think also what's just really unique about, yourself that I relate to is like you wear so many different hats. You mentioned, you were an educator in public schools. Now you have a tutoring company. And I relate to this because like all of a sudden after I wrote my book, I'm like, oh, I'm a writer now? Like, what does that mean? And you had come into contact with so many people. So can you just speak to that? Because I think as women, we carry multiple identities, and with that comes a lot of responsibility. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I taught in DC public schools for 17 years. I taught third grade and fourth grade. And prior to the pandemic, I decided to leave the classroom um, and launch a tutoring company with my partner teacher. Her name is Liz Kramer. And so she and I together, she also was a teacher of 17 years. We opened up for this company during the pandemic. So talk about doing all the things during the pandemic, writing a book, opening a company. And and as you know, to be an entrepreneur and to be able to kind of be in control of your destiny. And it's obviously a lot of responsibility, but it's also very, very rewarding. And it's similar to being in the classroom as a teacher. You wear many hats as well. And so you said resourceful, and I think teachers are some of the most resourceful individuals that I've ever encountered. And I think that helped a lot going into opening my own company, because again, you have to be able to work under stress and under pressure and be able to manage people and work well with people. And of course there was that educational lens too. And then it's funny, my teaching career really helped me with this book as well. And not just as a writer, but also as someone to be able to share my book. And so public speaking, and I give now tours sometimes based on my book. And, I think of these tours are kind of like extended tours, like field trips with much more cooperative participants than 8, 9-year-olds. And yeah, and I teach yoga and fitness and I do wear a lot of hats. It's something that I think so many women do without people even realizing it or acknowledging it, women included. I think it's kind of just how a lot of us are programmed. But it's something to, yeah, calendars and notes and all of the things. I have Post-its everywhere in my table, and things to keep you organized. And I also have women. Yes, you can see
Always.
Post-its all around me too. But also I think, and I'm sure you can speak a lot to this, just surrounding myself by other really strong women, right? And so my business partner is equally a strong woman, and having so many friends who are supportive and so forth. So that's important as well.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for sharing. I know that our participants are really eager to dive into the book and actually hear some stories and learn about some women. So I want to get there. I think a good segue to bring to the surface here is this idea of place-based learning, which we have worked with the National Women's History Museum on some projects. And what exactly you just said, coming out of the classroom and going to visiting these places is just a different style of learning and education. And what I love so much about your book, and you can, if people are following at home, I'll try to tell you the page numbers and stuff as well. But as soon as you open it up to the content, there is so much creativity. This isn't just like Capitol building. It is, very, you put thought and really you got a little cute with it. So I think your teaching background shows. So let's get into just how is the book formatted, and how should people be reading it start to end, or should they be carrying it around the city? How is it used?
I think that there's lots of different ways that you can read this book. You certainly do not have to read it start to end. You can read each entry. There are 84 entries in the book, and you can think about each entry as kind of being its own isolated chapter. And so I know people, it's mostly DC, about, bless you, about 85% of the book or so is DC. And then I have some spots in Northern Virginia as well as in Montgomery County and so forth of Maryland. And so, yeah, it's a lot of places that you can actually go visit. And I'll talk some about some places that are female focused. Some are histories and stories that aren't necessarily a place per se, but really fun, like hidden stories that people might not know about. And then, yeah, so it's kind of, it's a great way that, yes, you should carry around and walk around the city and of course explore the city, but you can do in any order that you want. And I think it's funny, when I started writing the book, you know, I think when you start writing a book, so much of history that you see is male centered, right? White male focused. And it really, as I was writing, I had to make that kind of shift and realize like, wow, like what I'm finding is so male based, and there was nothing wrong with that. And I had a lot of great stories that have men as their focus, but I had to really purposely make sure that I was seeking out stories that revolved and focused on women and individuals of color and so forth. So can we dive into some of those stories?
For sure. I'm ready. I have my Post-its. And so I want to go, we're going to kind of go in order as best as we can. Page 18 for folks following along. This is a hidden site in the city that I absolutely love. Lincoln's Cottage at the Old Soldiers' Home. I think it's just fascinating. And you took such an interesting angle to depict First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln in a way that I think few people know. So let's dive into it. First Lady seances at the Old Soldiers' Home.
Yeah. So, you know, as I was researching, I learned a lot about Mary Todd Lincoln, and she's a fascinating woman. I think sometimes she's misunderstood. But the story in my book that pertains to her is her interest and her kind of belief into the occult. And so back during the Civil War era, seances, or spirit circles as they were known back then, were very popular. And they were popular among various people, different people of different social economic background and so forth, mostly because so many individuals were losing loved ones during the war, that it gave individuals an opportunity, or at least a belief, that they could reconnect with loved ones. Mary Todd Lincoln was no exception to that. And so when her son Willie died in 1862, of course, as a mother, she was grieving, and she started attending these seances. And one of the places she attended these seances was at the now Lincoln's Cottage in Northwest DC. And so she attended these seances, and she truly was a believer. It's known that her husband, Abraham Lincoln, would attend some seances with her, not because he necessarily believed in them, but mostly because he wanted to kind of go and just check things out and kind of go in a protective way. And he also kind of summoned some, you know, reporters and people that he knew to kind of go check things out as well. Well, there was one medium in particular who was very, very popular. His name was Lord Colchester. He was the illegitimate son of an English duke. And so he would run these seances, and there was, you know, scratching and tugging of the hair and tugging of the clothes and so forth. And so Abraham Lincoln's people who came out finally realized, and that he was a fraud. Shocking. And so and then he was, of course, upset that they, you know, kind of called him out on it. And so even though seances were pretty popular, and they were, you know, accepted back then, there, of course, is still gossip. You're the first lady, you're someone of an elite stature. And so there was gossip that she attended. And so Lord Colchester threatened to kind of go to the papers and tell everyone that she was a believer in the occult. And so, as we know with politics, they squashed that right away. Although, again, people still had their ideas. Later on, when the Lincolns then moved to the White House, Mary Todd Lincoln continued to participate in seances. It's not documented that Abraham Lincoln ever did in the White House, but I have another entry in my book about how the White House has lots of stories about it being haunted, and different ghosts have been seen, Abraham Lincoln one of them. And the rumor, or at least the belief, is that Mary Todd Lincoln kind of opened the portal to the occult in the White House. And the reason why there have been so many ghost sightings from Abigail Adams to Abraham Lincoln is because of Mary Todd Lincoln and her participation in seances. So,
wow.
Yeah.
It's an excellent story. It's I think in today's day and age, people are sort of into witchy things or supernatural or whatever you want to call it. So it's very relatable. And for a first lady who is, I agree, so misunderstood, that's just an excellent perspective. And the fact that she was a grieving mother, which I think is an important part of her story as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, let's go on a tour around town. Let's go down to the National Mall and let's go to page 24. 24. Now,
This is one of my favorites.
yeah, she's, I think, a favorite. Once you learn about her, you're like totally a groupie. This talks about the oldest profession in the world. Tell us about what that is, JoAnn.
All right. So if you go to the National Mall, of course, monuments, memorials, museums, and the American Indian Museum is one of the prominently featured museums on the mall. I think it's one of the most stunning in terms of architecture. But what a lot of people don't know, what I discovered during my book and my research, is that the American Indian Museum was built on a site of a former brothel. But even more interesting to me is that during the Civil War era, so we're back to the Civil War era, DC actually had over 100 brothels. Brothels became very popular in the sense that if you think about wartime, a lot of individuals are coming in and out of the city, especially at that time, men, soldiers, generals, and so forth. And so brothels became pretty popular. There was an area in DC that kind of spans now from what is known from Capitol Hill and Federal Triangle, which is not too far from the White House, as Hooker's Division. So that's where the brothels were pretty highly concentrated there. So the site where the American Indian Museum was owned by a woman, her name was Mary Ann Hall. And not only was she a brothel owner, but she was considered to be one of the most prosperous and one of the most successful brothel owners and businesswomen of that time. She was among the elite. She was a socialite. She was highly respected. I'll fast forward a little bit, so much that she's actually buried at Congressional Cemetery, which is a very kind of esteemed cemetery in Capitol Hill, if you're not familiar with DC, that she and other prominent individuals are buried there. So to kind of give you an idea of how well respected she was. And so she was a very astute businesswoman. She chose this particular land because this land was real estate right in the middle of this Hooker's Division. So she had access, she was convenient to Capitol Hill, where you had, businessmen and so forth, convenient to Federal Triangle and so forth. So she was very strategic in where she placed her brothel. She also was known to be a very good business owner and a very good boss. She treated her women very well. She provided healthcare. She took care of them. And years later, when the brothel closed, and again, of course, later on, when they were excavating the land to build the American Indian Museum, they found all of these artifacts and relics from the brothel days. So they found porcelain, and they found champagne flutes and champagne corks and china and so forth, that led you to believe that they lived a really nice life. They lived a pretty extravagant, luxurious life. There weren't a lot of people back then that were sipping champagne and so forth.
Yeah.
So she's one of my favorites by far, and one of my favorite entries in my book. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of those entries that sort of, the story is below the surface of the museum. There's not really any markers there, but I would encourage people to go visit her headstone at Congressional Cemetery, one of the most fascinating cemeteries in all of DC, and tons of famous people buried there. So Mary Ann Hall, yes.
Yeah.
All right, let's continue our tour. Walking, riding our bike. I don't know. We got to go over to DuPont Circle. So page 34. This is also a favorite. And you wouldn't think it's sort of historical, but there's a little history behind it. The Barbie Pond. The Barbie Pond. As soon as I think about it, it makes me want to sing that Barbie song from the 90s, but I won't do that. I'll save you. But the Barbie Pond, JoAnn, I follow them on Instagram. I would encourage everybody to do that, but we have an expert with us, so go ahead and tell us about it.
So the Barbie Pond, again, I know I'm going to say this a lot, but really it's also another favorite entry. And so I think there are some locals in DC who are fans like you are, and of course now me, and who know the Barbie Pond inside and out. There are other individuals who I know, friends of mine, who have lived here for years and had no idea the Barbie Pond existed. So it's a little bit off the beaten path. I think it's gaining a lot of popularity, and I think it's gaining, you know, they now like have a big Instagram following and so forth. So over in DuPont Circle on Q Street between 14th and 15th Northwest is this art installation that is comprised strictly of Barbie dolls. And so it is, the artists live there. It is like their front yard. So you can walk by it. You can stop by from the sidewalk. It's fairly small. I mean, it's city living. But these artists who are pretty much for the most part anonymous. I've messaged them on Instagram. They've given me some photos to use and so forth. But other than that, I don't know their names. And I don't think a lot of individuals do.
No.
In general. Yeah. But these Barbie doll installations are incredible. So these artists, they change the themes about once a month, give or take. And they do anything from pop culture to holidays like Halloween and Cinco de Mayo and 4th of July, to current events. And so during, you know, the elections and during right now with Ukraine and so forth, they do these art installations that kind of mirror and they kind of reflect all of these things. Yeah, so you can see on the screen, that's one of the installations about getting out the voice, to use your voice and vote. Whereas there was another art installation that it was like a pool party because it was summertime, right? But they're really elaborate. They're really involved. Of course, there are some props. Halloween, they go all out, so crazy. It's worth visiting. Again, it's one of my favorites. I think a lot of people think of DC as being a very like buttoned up kind of conservative town. And there are aspects of that, of course, but there's also really fun, avant-garde, kind of cutting edge, you know, eccentric part of DC too. And I think Barbie Pond kind of exemplifies that as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's fun. Go check it out. All right. I'm going to skip ahead sort of a little bit towards the back of the book. I know this next place is one of my favorites. Let's go to page 136. The title for this chapter is "We're Waiting for You, Madam President." Mm-hmm. And I just love looking at the book too, because then there's sort of like a teaser right after it. Why is there an uncarved lump behind the portrait monument's 3 suffragists? And it's sort of a memorial, but it's also a sculpture that makes you think about the future. So tell us about this portrait monument in the Capitol Rotunda.
Yeah, so if you go to the Capitol Rotunda, there are statues and so forth of many individuals, many being men. This particular portrait, or this monument, I should say, it's called the Portrait Monument. And so there are 3 distinct, I don't know how well you can see this, but the 3 women that you can see prominently distinct are 3 women suffragists, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. I should say the sculptor of this monument, her name is Adelaide Johnson. She's also buried at Congressional Cemetery, just like Marianne Hall. So
she's so interesting. Oh my gosh.
So interesting. And so she created this incredible statue of these 3 women in 1920, right around the 19th Amendment, with, you know, giving white women the right to vote. But she left this lump that's uncarved in the back. And it's very pretty noticeable that it's uncarved. And if you talk to tour guides and historians today, which is who I spoke with, there is a common theme or a common belief that that uncarved lump was purposely left unfinished because it was Adelaide Johnson trying to say, yes, we now have the right to vote, but women still have a very long way to go in terms of equality and so forth. And so that was kind of her way of showing us, we're not finished yet. There's still a long road ahead. There's also thought that she left that intentionally uncarved for the first female president, for once we had a first female president. Of course, years ago, many thought that Hillary Clinton would kind of take the place of that uncarved lump. We know how that ended up. But I should add, so if you think about when this statue was placed in 1920, not long after that, it was then removed from the rotunda and it was stored in a broom closet in the Capitol basement.
It hurts every time I hear it. It hurts.
It hurts your heart. And so if you think about art imitating life, when Adelaide Johnson said, We still have a long way to go. Could anything more exemplify that? And so not until 75 years later, in 1995, right, commemorating the 75th anniversary of women's suffrage, did women and benefactors and fundraisers decide to move the statue from the basement back to the rotunda. It cost $75,000 to transport it from the basement and have it go to the rotunda, where it is to this day. And so it's still there now, of course, thank goodness you can visit it. But what an incredible statue. And just knowing kind of how the journey it took to kind of go back to the rotunda 75 years is really mind-blowing.
Yeah. It's an amazing story, an amazing sculpture. I do want to take just a moment because I see some comments coming into the chat that I want to address in real time. And then also, as Lorianne had stated earlier, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A and we will catch them at the end. But Lorianne made a comment that the portrait monument was integral to the founding of the National Women's History Museum. I did not know that. I am going to nerd out about this later and read all about it. And then JoAnn, we can nerd out about it together. But that's super cool. And then there is another person asking about sort of images and some visuals to go with these stories. There are lots of visuals in the book. I know JoAnn really did a lot of research in gathering them. And also I would encourage folks to visit the National Women's History Museum website. It's just a wealth of knowledge. There's portraits and pictures of events. And so this is just the surface, and by all means, there's more information out there as well. And then you could go on a walking tour and see some of it for yourself. So yeah, let's move forward a little bit as well. Oh, okay. I'm going to go to page 138.
Okay.
A sword and its sorcerers.
Yes. This story is, I think, one of the most bizarre stories, and I mean that in a good way. A quick note, I gave a talk to a Girl Scout troop last summer. It's not a couple months ago, last summer. A lot of my former students who are now older, and I spoke to girls from 8 years old to 17 years old. And out of all of the stories I shared, this was the one that was the most popular, and I had the most questions. They were obsessed with the story. So without further ado, so the Joan of Arc statue is a really prominent statue. It's in Meridian Hill Park, which is in Columbia Heights, Northwest DC, and the park is beautiful. And the statue is Joan of Arc holding, in all of her power, a sword mounted on a horse. And to give you an idea about, so she's holding this sword, and the story really is about the sword. This sword, to give you an idea, it's 5 feet long and it weighs about 30 pounds. So it's a pretty sizable sword. And the reason why I'm harping on that is because this sword has been stolen 3 different times throughout the last century or so. And so let me backtrack. In 1922, a women's French group gave this statue to the United States as a gift. That was 1922. About 10 years later, in the early 1930s, this sword was stolen, but it was pretty much taken and kind of like thrown into like a bush, and it was bent. So it was still intact, but it was bent. And so it was then replaced. And again, mind you, it's 30 pounds. It's 5 feet tall. I'm only 5'2". So basically I'm more than 30 pounds, but it's a pretty sizable. So fast forward in, I want to get my dates right, 1978, this sword is now stolen again. So obviously, it's almost 50 years later. I can't imagine that they're related in terms of the thief. But it wasn't replaced until the 2000s. And so in 2016, it was replaced, and then it was stolen again. And so this is the 3rd time that this sword has been stolen. And so Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton eventually kind of, I don't want to say called out the National Park Service, but definitely kind of said something like, what's going on that we can't protect this sword? Like, we need to do better, basically. There's no reason that this sword keeps getting stolen. And so it took a couple years, but in 2018, it was finally replaced. And that was done, it was cost $18,000 to get replaced and kind of, fixed and so forth. But the History Channel and Lifetime Network actually worked together to raise this money to have it reinstalled and replaced. And so it's still there. Hopefully it won't be stolen anytime soon. But it's kind of crazy. And something else that I found interesting, and Kaitlin, you probably know this and probably more than I can even share, is that the Lifetime Network kind of did a study, and they said that Joan of Arc Statue is the only female equestrian statue in DC.
Mhm.
And according to their count, there's only about 200 historic statues of women throughout the US. Now, this was a couple of years ago, so maybe there's more by now, but kind of just letting us know, like, wow, when you think about how many historic statues there are and what a small number 200 is, or even if it's a little bit more than that. But that story blew my mind, and you could see like young kids really being obsessed about the sword, right? And so that's why it was really popular with my kiddos.
Yeah, it's a fun story, and whatever gets the kids interested. But like, listen, for the record, don't steal any swords or any monuments. Like, let's be respectful. But there are like 300 statues of men on horses that, if you had to go take a sword or like a shoe or something, just leave Joan of Arc like alone. She's one of our only ones that we have. It's a beautiful statue. Yeah, in DC, the statistics are always hard, and it gets a little wonky when you start talking about public land and private land and inside and outside. But roughly, there's about 10 or so statues of women in Washington, D.C. There's only 2 or now 3 American women on public land: Eleanor Roosevelt, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Ida B. Wells. Joan of Arc is a French woman. We have some other international women represented. But yeah, the representation is very slim. But I'm happy that your Girl Scouts could, see someone that looks like them, is actually probably similar to their age, and finds that relatable and a fun story.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are moving through this book. No one has to read it now. We went through everything. There's so much. All right, I'm going to skip to closer to the end of the book. I know we can talk a lot about this. Page 178, a wake-up call, a tribute to women. And this is recognizing the emergency call boxes that are now artwork to women, which we work so closely with. And I am so happy you included in this book. So let's go deep into this one. Tell me all the things.
Yeah, absolutely. This is another one of my favorites. And I think also because if you live in DC or you visit DC, there are these call boxes that are historic. Some of them have been restored and refurbished, and some have not. And they are defunct. They're no longer operating. They used to be two-way call systems that people would use for emergencies and so forth. But because some of them are so nondescript and even kind of falling apart in a sense, or at least rusty, a lot of times we walk by these call boxes and don't even realize they're there. I know that I have walked by countless call boxes, and it's easy to kind of walk by them when you're walking throughout the city. So as I said, a lot of call boxes have been restored, but this particular group of call boxes were restored by the Downtown Bid Project, and they solely focused on women throughout history. And so this area is around the White House. They stretch between 13th and G Streets Northwest, all the way to about 15th and L Northwest, but pretty concentrated in that downtown area. And so there are 8 call boxes that have been restored. There were 9 planned, 1 didn't come to fruition because of funding. But these call boxes, they're really cool. It's a way to kind of take these call boxes that are not used and convert them into these historical markers. And not only they're historical markers, they're also art markers too. They're art installations, and they're beautiful. They're painted different colors, often to kind of represent the individual. And so some individuals who are represented, Katharine Graham, of the Washington Post, and her call box is black and white, which is, reminiscent of the newspaper.
Yeah.
Like, how cool is that? There is Alma Thomas, who, the famous artist who I love. Her call box is very bright and beautiful and red and so forth. And I can tell more about the different individuals. And of course, Kaitlin, please add on. But what's great about these call boxes, yes, they're beautiful because they're painted, they're colorful, but they also have little plaques almost like if you were going to a museum, to give you a little description on the individual, the project, but also, what their contribution was to society. And sometimes they're on the side, sometimes they're on the back. A lot of times the base of the call box also will have certain words that represent that individual. So Alma Thomas, for example, she was a former educator. She was an art teacher. And so, it might say education or art teacher and so forth. So representing their contributions and their careers. A lot of women's suffrages, there's Alice Paul, there's Mary Church Terrell, there's Flora Moulton. She was a gospel folk singer who performed a lot on the street. Elizabeth Keckley, she was a seamstress who, her amazing seamstress work basically helped her buy her and her son's freedom out of slavery. She also was a confidant of Mary Todd Lincoln, and she was a seamstress for her and a friend. So kind of I learned so much about these individuals. And now when I go around the city, I look at call boxes, and there are so many more that have been restored and refurbished beyond this, beyond these. And Kaitlin, of course, feel free to add on. I know that you do a tour of our own of the call boxes.
Yeah, I do want to add on about the call boxes and some of the women. I also, before we forget, I want to shout out Charles Bergen and Mara Cherkasky, who were the historian and the artists on this project, because they did a phenomenal job. And yeah, so here's something interesting that has happened to me recently. Flora Moulton is featured in our book. We didn't talk about all of the call boxes. We decided to just focus on one, and Flora Moulton was just sort of calling our name. And we received an email from her great niece that said, "Thank you so much for highlighting her story." And it became very personal. It's like, these are monuments to living history. They're not that far away. And so I became more and more interested in Flora Moulton. And just like you mentioned, Elizabeth Keckley relates to Mary Todd Lincoln. That's what I love to do as a historian. Where are people connecting? And it occurred to me, you have Flora Moulton, who was actually performing on the corner of where the Macy's is now. She was singing protest music against the Vietnam War. And, that's beautiful and something that happens in DC quite often. And so on my tour route, I started, introducing people to that idea there, and then sort of ending by Katharine Graham, who's really well known for her Pentagon Papers, also really significant woman in the Vietnam War, a certain different kind of activism, but I love where their stories crisscross. And I just think it's really special that we can walk just a couple of blocks and have so much women's history right there in front of us, which, to be honest with you, 5 years ago was not that common. And now in the city, we're seeing it more. I'm kind of a sucker for Alice Paul because I'm from New Jersey, but do you have a favorite call box or person that's represented?
Honestly, I love, and what's really cool is when you're talking about in front of Macy's at like 13th and G, you have a twofer there, right? So Alma Thomas and Flora Moulton are their call boxes are right next to each other, which I think is really cool. I like their call boxes, and Mary Church Terrell, I really like as well. She was a teacher, and she, so I, that of course, resonates with me. She taught at what the school I think now is Dunbar. So I mean, she has a really incredible history and an incredible past, but they're so unique. They're so well done. They're so informative. They're just these living art. And it's really cool. I think also, when I was talking about earlier, the pandemic, right? These call boxes are a great example of how you can explore DC without going inside a museum, without paying to go and see things. And of course, we live in a city that we're very lucky that a lot of the museums are free. But I think there is also the notion that DC is not the cheapest city. It's a pretty expensive city, but there's so many amazing things that you can do for free. And I think visiting these call boxes is one example. Barbie Pond, another example of how you can really get a sense of the city, really learn about history, really learn about women who have had such an impact on our world without going inside anywhere, without paying a dime, which I think is really fantastic.
It is fantastic. And, we're talking about women here and families, and sometimes it is hard to take a whole family into a museum or out for the day. And I think these call boxes are really accessible from a mobility point of view. If you have a stroller, okay, you can just walk past them. They're colorful. Children can find them interesting. You know, people who are differently abled, I think you can just kind of get on a sidewalk and see it and not have to worry about going into museums or monuments with stairs and things like that. And that's also important when we're talking about these kinds of places and people having access to histories. So I think now that we're talking about it, all of our participants are really going to like see them everywhere, the call boxes. I want to move, sorry, go ahead.
No. This is not even, I just remember my school was in Capitol Hill. And so there was at this time in Capitol Hill in Southeast, when Prince died, one of the call boxes, it was painted purple. And at the time somebody put, you know, yellow and purple beads and like music notes and like posters and it was basically like an ode or a tribute to Prince. So there are really kind of cool kind of takes on call boxes that I think I think now people will walk around the city and see these call boxes that they never even noticed that were there, which is very cool.
Super cool. And also just to note, there are several local chapters of the Daughters of the American Revolution who are also restoring some of the call boxes. So outside of these sort of 8 government funded ones by the downtown bid, there are local groups also contributing. So they're everywhere. And I hope that continues. We're getting some feedback in the chat.
Okay.
I'm flashing the book quickly. I know, sorry, I have it right in front of me, but people want to see the cover and some of the chapters. Should
I open it? Is that helpful? Yeah. So this actually is a chapter about Congressional Cemetery.
Yeah, it's all black and white on the inside, but there are images.
It is mostly black and white, and then there are some images that are also color, as you can see. Yeah. So, and like, yeah. So I mentioned that I do go outside of DC into Virginia. So that's Arlington Cemetery, the National Cathedral, the Exorcist stairs in Georgetown. These are the stairs that were famously displayed and featured in the scary, thrilling movie, The Exorcist.
The workout to go up and down.
So, yeah. So just to kind of give you an idea, but I think when you were asking earlier, like about reading the book and so forth, I mentioned that every entry is kind of, you know, isolated or, you know, it's an independent entry. Each entry is 2 pages. So this is formatted also by my publisher, Secret DC, as part of a series. And so they do secrets throughout the entire country. There's Secret St. Louis, there's Secret Chicago, Secret Tampa Bay, and so forth. But they have a format. And so to give you an idea, every entry spans 2 pages, gives you a little bit of information about what it is, where you can find it, if there's a cost associated, maybe a pro tip or some kind of thing that's nice to know as a visitor, and then some photos that correspond with the entry. So that's kind of the same format for every entry. So it's pretty uniform throughout the book. Yeah.
2 more things that we're going to talk about before we sort of end the program and come to Q&As. So if you are watching, now's the time. Questions. There's no question that's too far out there we want to answer. We are going to talk about your second book because I know it's in the works and it's coming, but I want to also focus on one more chapter that is a little bit of a different perspective, but you know, early on we talked about how a lot of your stories intersect at different socioeconomic classes and statuses. And so we talk about this, of course, with Toho, just women's history is everyone's history and it's American history. I know this is one of your favorite chapters. It was a surprise to me as well. You managed to surprise a lot of tour guides, so job well done. Yeah. Round and Round, page 74, a carousel takes a turn into the civil rights movement. This is such an iconic thing on the National Mall, and your story is fantastic.
Oh, thank you. This is another favorite. So on the National Mall, of course, we know the iconic carousel that if you live here, you've visited DC, chances are you have walked by it. Maybe you've also even been on the carousel. But what I found was a really great story about its history. And so the carousel wasn't always on the mall. It came from an amusement park in Maryland called, oh, it's escaping me, of course. It came from Gwynn Oak Amusement Park that was right outside of Baltimore. And so at the time, this carousel was there on the same day that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech in August of 1963. That particular day, that amusement park, Gwynn Oak, discontinued segregation. And so on that same day, it was the first time ever that 2 white children and an African-American child rode on the carousel simultaneously. That had never happened before. And so the little girl, the African-American girl, of course, she's an adult now. She was about 11 months old. Her name was Sharon Langley. She actually she wrote a book commemorating that moment. It's a kid's book. It's a children's book, like a big picture book. I think it's called A Ride to Remember. But so that happened. So fast forward in the early 1980s, the carousel leaves Gwynn Oak Amusement Park and is transported to the National Mall. So about 20 years or so later. And so it was bought by individuals. And that's another thing. I always thought the carousel was owned by the National Park Service, or it's not, it's privately owned. And so when these individuals bought the carousel and brought it to the mall, they did not know that story. That story didn't come to light until later on. And so now if you go to the carousel, there is a plaque on the side that commemorates that, just that tie into civil rights and the civil rights movement. And what I think it's such a wonderful story, but I think what's also really lovely is that the carousel is not too far from where Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, right? And so how fitting is it that that carousel is, within walking distance, or within vision at least, of, the memorial where King delivered a speech. And so it's just a feel good story. I love that story. And yeah, it's one of my favorites for sure.
Excellent. Well, we dove into a lot of stories today, mostly women, sites in DC that maybe people didn't know about, other sites that maybe you visited, but you have a new perspective. And so I want to thank you, JoAnn, for elevating women's stories. It sort of seemed to come a little bit natural to you, but, we do live kind of in a society where women are overlooked. And so having them included in your book, I know it's just special and it's important. I want to also just give you this opportunity for, let everyone know what your next project is, your next book, and how we can further support your career.
Well, thank you. And first of all, and thank you, Kaitlin. This is wonderful. It's nice talking to a friend, but also in this kind of format is really lovely too. So thank you. Great questions. You did wonderful. So I had mentioned that my publisher, they do a lot of series. Secret DC is a series. Another series that they do is a scavenger hunt series. My publisher is based in St. Louis. And so what happens is they start their books in St. Louis, and then they kind of expand from there. And so St. Louis scavenger hunt book during the pandemic was a really kind of popular book. It was popular among families and millennials and older people looking to find ways to get outside. And so they reached out to me and asked me to write the DC version. And so to give you a quick synopsis, it is a scavenger hunt book throughout DC and only DC, whereas this book goes into Virginia, Maryland. The scavenger hunt book is only in DC. It spans 17 neighborhoods throughout DC. And each neighborhood is kind of like its own chapter. And it's a scavenger hunt of every place is outside. So again, talk about not having to spend money or go inside. And they're riddles. And so I wrote basically 4-line riddles about anything from obviously statues, monuments, memorials, call boxes, to storefronts, library signs, restaurant signs. You have to be kind of careful because you want to make sure that these places 5 years from now will still, you have to be a little careful in terms of what you choose. Parks, plaques, you name it. And it was such a fun book to write in the sense of talk about going out and exploring a city through a different lens and planning out a scavenger hunt book, but then also writing the clues. I tried to be playful, connect things with pop culture, but also give a little bit of history. And so they're informative, but also while having fun. It's super, super fun. So I'm in edits right now. The book is done, but I'm of course going back and forth with edits. So it should be coming out in the fall. I think September 1st is most likely going to be the release date, but it's called DC Scavenger. And it's just It's fun. It's a lot more fun than I ever thought I would ever have writing rhymes.
Excellent. Excellent. So we look forward to your new book. We thank you for sharing Secret Washington, D.C. with us. I know some folks had some questions about where you can purchase this book. Lori-Ann and the National Women's History Museum have included a link to a Ivy bookshop, and I'll let Lori-Ann come and maybe come back on screen soon and tell us about that. I want to take this opportunity to thank the National Women's History Museum and the DC Public Library for hosting this program, and I want to thank everybody for supporting myself, A Tour of Her Own, and all of the women here in this room who are elevating her story. Happy Women's History Month.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a real thrill, so I can't thank you enough for having us. Thank you.
Stick around, please, because we do have a few questions from our audience. So Cheryl Fine, who, by the way, Cheryl, thank you for your continued support. She's a frequent audience member here at our NWHM Presents programming, but she noted that each section of your book is really like its own learning unit. Was that intentional? Can you tell us a little bit more about how you set up each unit like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I tried to be as strategic as possible and have a pretty kind of diverse or diversity in the places and the stories that I wanted to tell. So in the sense of that, making sure that, yes, I was going to parks and museums and gardens and cemeteries, but also kind of making sure that I'm also telling stories about history. So living in DC, right? DC's history really is a lot of America's history. So I wanted to include some crazy stories about presidential assassinations, like James Garfield, which I had no idea about, talking about some hidden stories around museums and monuments that people know of, but might not know those hidden stories out there. I also wanted to, of course, it's hard to write a DC book without having some spy or espionage related stories. So I made sure to kind of look into that. Some off the beaten path places, some underground tunnels, some underground societies. So my goal was to be as diverse and have a variety of different stories and entries, because I was very interested in those stories, but I also thought then readers would be as well. And I wanted to have enough stories that were different enough and interesting enough that there'd be a little bit of something for everyone. And so I hope that I did that. And I hope that answers the question. Did that answer the question okay?
It was more of a comment, a note. She noted it.
Oh, like,
there was a question in there.
Right? The teacher and me, very structured, but also giving a little bit of laughter. It's the writing process that you teach as a teacher. I think I brought that into the book as well.
Absolutely. And then Pamela asked, can you talk a little bit more about, if this is something you're knowledgeable about, the Alice Paul Belmont House, which is now owned by the National Park Service. Have you managed to get any interesting stories out of the Belmont House?
I have not. Kaitlin, I don't know if there's anything that you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. We're pretty familiar with the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. It is a mouthful. Some folks know it as the Sewell Belmont House, but it is rebranded now as the Belmont Paul House. Unfortunately, it is, as I understand, not open at the moment because of COVID, and that's quite sad. But the inside of it is like a treasure chest. Original banners and flags from the suffragists. It was the headquarters of the National Women's Party. So earlier we had talked about Alice Paul, who was one of the leaders of the National Women's Party. She ended up staying in that house later on after the 19th Amendment. And I think what's so special about the Belmont Paul House is its location. It is right on Capitol Hill, just behind the Capitol building, just off to the side of the Supreme Court. And there's a wealth of history in there. I do believe that the National Women's Party and the National Park Service were co-running it, but I do believe it's solely in the National Park Service now. And some of the collection is part of the Library of Congress. And Lori Ann, if you're familiar with this, please jump in. So it's a little bit of a mix and mingle. And I just hope in the next few months they can reopen. And it is certainly a site that like we need to support, like financially, showing up, all of the things. It's a treasure, and it just is the best women's history place I think that we have in the city.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The house and the site sits on is part of the National Park Service now, and a good portion of its collections is now under the auspices of the Library of Congress. So they'll be kept safe for many generations to come. Thank you for that, Kaitlin. And one of our attendees who has asked, and I'm going to just shoot this out to both of you, who is your favorite woman from history, or a woman whose story or impact you think more people should know?
Cool. Let me think about that. Well, this is, I did an interview months ago, and someone asked me a great question, and they asked, if you could fly and be on an international flight of 10 to 12 hours with any woman in history, who would you choose? And I immediately answered Julia Child. So that's who my answer is going to be, in the sense that I just think she is fascinating. I'm a huge cook. I love how she kind of, played by her own rules, didn't kind of conform to society, lived her life her way. And so I'm going to say Julia Child.
Love Julia Child. Can't go wrong there. I just think of butter every time I think of her. I'm going to go with a woman that most people probably don't know about, but I have done a lot of research on lately. Her name is Alethia Tanner, and there is a park named for her in the Noma neighborhood. And the residents of the neighborhood, they took a poll or a vote, and they wanted her name on this park. She was an enslaved woman who sold produce in Lafayette Square outside of the White House. She ended up buying her own freedom. And with that money, she purchased the freedom of her family members. She started schools for young African-American children, and she founded the AME Church. She's known as the godmother of the AME Church. So she is definitely a hidden figure. Part of the reason why we know her story is because of her descendants who went to the city council and shared it. And so Alethia Tanner has credible history, and people should visit the park and learn more about her.
I want to learn more about her. That sounds like a new biography for the National Women's History Museum's online biographies. So I'm definitely going to research her more. So we're coming, I think, to the end of our questions here. But one question I've been getting all evening is, will there be a recording of the program? The answer is yes, always. And it will be available early next week on the museum's dedicated YouTube channel. That means you go onto YouTube, search for the National Women's History Museum. We do have a dedicated channel where all the recordings from our programmings can be found, including this one, starting early next week. In the meantime, I'm just going to go ahead and say thank you to both JoAnn and Kaitlin for being here. Thank you to our audiences for joining us this evening. Thank you again to our generous sponsor, Time Warner Media, and our co-presenter for this month's programming, DC Public Library. If you enjoyed this NWHM Presents presentation, then we encourage you to join us again on Sunday, April 3rd for Sundays at Home, as we continue uncovering hidden stories from history. On Sunday, historian Kimberly Hess will introduce us to the unexpected life of Sarah B. Cochran at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. For a full listing of upcoming programs and for registration information, please visit the Public Programs and Events tab at www.womenshistory.org. All events are free, but advanced registration is required. And until next time we meet, please stay safe and healthy, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.